And so today is a shared session. So first you will be hearing from Francis from NACRE and then Alex from Northampton Community Foundation. So Francis, if I can ask you to share your screen and make it start.
Great. No, thank you very much. I will, and I will get going. Yes. Right, well, thank you very much everyone for joining us today. I'm just going to do a very quick 10-minute presentation about the Rural Community Buildings Loan Fund. I'm Frances Harris from Northamptonshire NACRE, and I'm the Community Facilities Advisor, so I help groups like village halls, community centres, playing fields and recreation grounds. Just a quick word about Northamptonshire NACRE. We are a charity based in Northamptonshire, and we're the only county charity that works exclusively with rural communities. We were founded in 1947, so we've been in operation for a few years now, and we provide help on a range of matters to do with community development, so things like neighbourhood plans. We can also help with good neighbour schemes, and we currently have funding of £700 to new groups who'd like to form good neighbour schemes. So do get in touch with us if you might be interested in that. My particular role is to provide help and support, as I've said, for community facilities, assets such as community buildings, but also recreation grounds and playing fields, and that covers a range of things like sorry, okay, I hope you can all hear me now again. So governance, so things like governing documents, but we can also help with things like sample policies and model documents and similar matters. So Northamptonshire NACRE, we are one of 38 charitable local development agencies. There's an equivalent organisation in pretty much every county in England, and together we formed what's called the NACRE network, and that is part funded by DEFRA. And our umbrella body is called National NACRE. I'm mentioning this because it's relevant for the purposes of the fund I'm going to be talking about. First, a very quick word. I don't know how many who are here who have anything to do with community buildings, but it was recently announced that there's a brand new fund which has been launched specifically for village halls. It's the Platinum Jubilee Fund. This is really good news. It's a £3 million DEFRA fund, and it will run until about 2025. And will help with halls to make improvements and modernizations, so things like installing Wi-Fi, and hopefully, you know, up to around 125 halls will benefit from that. Not much information yet, though, so do feel free to contact us at Northamptonshire NACRE if you might be interested. But we will be sharing information once it becomes available. So getting onto the Rural Community Buildings Loan Fund. This is a loan fund which is designed to help community buildings fill temporary gaps in funding. It's very flexible, can be very helpful. It can make funds available immediately, thus allowing works to be done immediately. And it offers a flexible, easy to understand repayment system, unlike many commercial loans. The fund, again, it's a DEFRA fund. It's worth currently £700,000 is in the funding pot. It's managed by that umbrella organisation I mentioned earlier, National NACRE. It was started in the 1930s, so it's very venerable. The average loan is about £15,000 per lender. And per recipient, I should say, and there are roughly 10 to 14 new loans each year. So who can apply? Well, as the name would suggest, it is designed for community buildings. So this would be village and parish halls, community centres, reading rooms and church halls. there might be scope for helping with things like scout huts or sports pavilions, but the key thing is that the building must be widely used by the community, and you will be asked for evidence to show that when you make your application. So what can it be used for? Basically for capital projects. So constructing new community buildings, it can help to fund extensions and renovations, and it can help with emergency repairs. I think where it's particularly helpful is that it can aid cash flow on large build projects. So I'm sure many of you will have come across this. You can be very successful in securing grant funding, but there's a disconnect between your work schedule and your cash flow, basically. So what the loan can do is allow you to fund the works until you receive all of your grant funding. But what it won't do is pay for fixtures and fittings. And again, an additional bit of flexibility, you can apply even if the project has started. There's a very, very simple application process. So the loan is administered, or the fund is administered by National ACRE, as I mentioned, but the administration is carried out by each member within the ACRE network. So in the case of Northamptonshire, that is Northamptonshire ACRE. So if you're interested in applying, you can either contact National ACRE or Northamptonshire ACRE. National ACRE will then supply the relevant paperwork, which will include the application form. We here at Northamptonshire ACRE will help you and give you guidance about filling in that application form, and in terms of the other information that you need to provide. We then submit the documentation to National ACRE, and ACRE will assess the application, and if they have any further questions, they will come back to us, Northamptonshire ACRE, and we will work with you in answering those queries and then submitting a final version of the application. But the final decision is made by National ACRE, and there are no application deadlines, so you can apply at any time. So just certain conditions which attach to the loan. As I said, usually the loans are up to around £15,000, but they can be larger, up to 20,000, and occasionally even larger than that. You do need to show that you've got security of 10 years. So either you own your property on a freehold basis, or if you have a lease, it usually will need to run for at least 21 years. There is a little bit of flexibility around that. And loans can be, plus the interest, are repaid within 5 or 8 years, but there are no penalties for early repayment, which is a real plus, unlike with a commercial loan. So given the example I mentioned earlier, where it's being used as bridging finance, once all your grant funding is in place and you're in a position to repay the loan, then you can do so and there will be no penalties. So finally here, I've just put up a slide with contact information. On the left-hand side, you can see that that's the contact information for National ACRE, who are based in Woodstock in Oxfordshire. If you Google ACRE, their contact details, you'll find them very easily. Equally, you can make an initial approach via us at Northamptonshire ACRE, and I've given our basic contact information there. But again, you'll find that on our website. So I'll stop sharing now. So I promised to keep to 10 minutes, which I hope I have.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask Frances? I know this is a reasonably new sort of way of working for a number of organisations, so I wonder if people have anything they'd like to ask.
I've got a question actually. Is it just aimed at sort of community centres, village halls that are rural, or can community centres that are more in more urban areas also apply?
Alex, that's a good question. I think it's just a kind of the rural community buildings bit, I think, is just sort of harking back to when it was founded in the 1930s. They provided it's a community building with wide community use, anyone can apply.
Great. And there isn't sort of any stipulation about it necessarily being in an area of like multiple deprivation or anything like that?
No, there isn't.
And presumably it sounds like there isn't a lot of the kind of complicated processes to be gone through that there would be with a loan from a bank or somewhere. There's no approval
at all.
apart from the application.
Absolutely, and it's a very straightforward application, and you should get a decision within about 3 weeks actually, which, you know, it can be really, really helpful. And again, I think in that bridging finance situation, you know, where you have a cash flow problem,
Yes.
It can be a real help.
Yes, I can see how that would work. Absolutely. So do we have any more questions from anybody? Okay, I don't think we do. So, but if anybody thinks of anything later, they can get in touch with you with the details on the on your slides. So
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Francis. That's been really useful. So if I can hand over to Alex now. And
thank you. I'll just get my the old screen up. Just bear with me a moment. There we go. Hopefully everyone can see that okay. So my name's Alex. I'm the grants manager at Northamptonshire Community Foundation, and this session is just going to be talking about some broad hints and tips on applying for grants. It's going to be fairly broad because it's from sort of our perspective as a funder, but I didn't want to make it just about applying to Northamptonshire Community Foundation grants, but for applying to lots of different funders. So things to have in mind when you're making any kind of grant application, basically. And as always, if you're thinking about applying for a grant, do get in touch with your local infrastructure organisation if you want any assistance in terms of looking for grant funders, or often LIOs also help with looking at and reviewing draft applications as well. So have a look out for what services are on offer. So things to first think about when you are applying for funding is that first starting block is thinking about, have you got the right systems in place? Are you at the right stage in your organisation to apply for grant funding? So thinking back again, right at the start, have you formed an official organisation yet? So do you have a constitution or some type of governing documents? Have you got the basic systems in place? So for instance, have you got a committee or a board of trustees or a board of directors, depending on what type of organisation you decide to become? So whether that's a constituted group or a charity or a social enterprise, have you got those systems in place and that committee or senior leader team in place to make those decisions? Then have you got a community bank account? Have you got 2 signatories on that bank account to make sure that you are reducing the likelihood of fraud? And have you got those systems in place in terms of financial procedures? Thinking about, have you got the relevant policies in place? So have you thought about health and safety, safeguarding, equality and diversity? Do you need insurance? Things like that you need to think about before deciding on projects and applying for grant funding. Again, lots of information and advice out there on the internet, or you can get in contact with your local infrastructure organisation, such as VIN, SERV, SMVB, Groundwork, Northamptonshire, etc. And also organisations like NACRE or Northamptonshire Black Communities Together as well. So once you've got those policies and systems in place, Then you will probably start thinking about project planning. So who, why, when, where, and how. So what type of project do you want to deliver? Who is it going to be for? Why is there a need for it? When and where is it going to happen? How are you going to deliver it? And how are you going to make a difference? And how will you demonstrate that difference? So moving on to that, thinking about an action plan. So using this is a sort of a bit of an acronym, the T, GROW exercise. So what is the issue that you are trying to tackle as an organisation? So sometimes that might be referred to as a need. So what is the need in the project? So it could be that as an organisation that you've noticed that there is a lot of isolation. It could be rural isolation, for instance, if you are as as it says, like if you're in a rural area, there's lack of transport, for instance, there might be rural isolation. Or if you're perhaps an organisation that works with older people, that you might think that there's a need, for instance, in terms of isolation. Or it could be that you're working with people who are more likely to experience things like falls, or it could be a whole host of different things that you're looking to tackle as an issue. So once you've identified that, think about what your goal is. So what are you trying to achieve? What are the aims? So what are you trying to do? Are you trying to obviously reduce the isolation? Are you trying to increase volunteering? Are you trying to reduce food poverty, reduce the likelihood of falls, if we go back to that example? And then thinking about the reality. So where are you now? So what resources do you already have to help you achieve your goals? So you, for instance, if we again go back to that reducing falls sort of example that I was talking about, you might, for instance, think, okay, how do we reduce falls for people who are older? So you might think, okay, let's think about maybe different exercise sessions that we could provide to help increase strength and balance. Or you might think about wanting to provide equipment to people in their homes to help them. So once you've got some ideas about how you might achieve your aims and goals, then you might think about what do we need. So if you want to go down the exercise route, what skills might you already have? Do you have a member of staff who could deliver that project or those exercise sessions? Do you have a volunteer? Have you got a venue for those exercise sessions to take place? So what resources do you already have available to you that you could utilize? And as part of that, it's then thinking about what resources don't you have and what you would need to be able to achieve it. Then thinking about what are the possibilities. So who could you work with? Who could you partner up with? It may be that there's somebody who is another organisation that might be delivering similar work, but maybe in a different part of the county or a different area that you might want to partner up with. It could be that you're thinking about, in terms of the options and the possibilities, you might have more of a wish list and some things which are more essential to delivering the project, thinking about how much funding you would need to be able to make this happen. And then the last one, the will. So how committed are you? If you have been along to the funding sessions this week, then you will probably have heard that there's a different range of waiting times in terms of grants being processed. So it can take sometimes between 3 to 6 months for funding to be awarded, depending on the funder and the size of the grant. So it can take commitment to obviously not only get your group together, put your application together, then wait for the outcome of that funding and then deliver the project. Obviously, this is not news to anybody who has gone down the funding process before, but anybody who is new to it, it's good just to sort of have a bit of a reality check in terms of thinking about what kind of pace sometimes projects happen at. So things to consider. So the top of the list, we've got, how do you know that there's a need? How can you evidence this? So often funders will ask that question so that we can understand how you know this. So it could be that you have perhaps looked at data and statistics in your area. You might have got feedback or testimonials or case studies that are able to help you evidence there is a need for this project and a need for a grant to make this project happen. And then, for instance, some funders will want to see that there's been some type of consultation involved, particularly if you are sort of working with a group or a community, that you aren't doing things to the community, but you're doing them with the community. Some funders will want to see that type of co-production, that, as I said, that type of consultation work that's taken place. There is also, thinking about, have you looked at local research that you can use to support your aims? So, for instance, on the Community Foundation, our website, there is a section called Northamptonshire Insights, and that's where we've put together some data and statistics that organisations can use, obviously if they're applying to us, but also to other funders as well. But there are lots of different data sets out there that you could have a look at, as well as I said, thinking about, have you spoken to people in your area, thinking about using those quantitative and qualitative types of data, hard and soft data, to evidence what you that there is a need in your community for this project to happen. And as I said as well at the start, or near the start, think about, is there another organisation out there that's already doing this work? Are you going to be duplicating something which has already happened? So once you've done your research and you've got together the evidence and need for your project, then and you've found, for instance, some funds that you think you should apply to. Obviously, the first thing to do is check the eligibility. So are you able to apply? Different funders fund different types of organisations. Sometimes it's based on also different themes. So as again, if you've attended other sessions this week, you will have seen that some funders will only fund registered charities, others will fund social enterprises, whereas some don't. Some fund schools, some don't. So it's always good to just double check that your organisation is eligible and that they are wanting to fund the type of project that you're looking to do. So for instance, if you're looking for capital funding for your village hall, for instance, then it's not going to be successful if you go to, let's say, the Arts Council, who are wanting to fund arts and culture projects. Obviously, that's quite a sort of an obvious example, but it's making sure that you don't shoehorn your project to fit into a fund where it doesn't naturally fit. So again, one of the ways of being able to combat that is, if you are unsure, have a chat to the grants team of the organisation that you're looking for funding for. So whether that's by email or phone, there's no problem. Lots of funders would rather that you took some time out of the day to get in contact with them, rather than maybe spending hours and hours writing an application that just doesn't fit. So taking some time out to send an email or have a phone conversation will save everybody a lot of time, just to check things over, give them a call and find out. Another way of doing that is of double checking whether you think it's going to fit with that funder or not, is looking at what they've previously funded in the past. So perhaps some example case studies, or you can have a look on the funders website, or on 360 Giving Grant Nav, which is basically a database of funding. So it's part of this move towards transparent funding, having transparency and being able for funders and grant makers to publicise what funding they've made available and to who. And so you can look at, and you can do that in lots of different ways. You can search geographically, so what's been funded locally in your area, or you can do that by organisation in terms of the recipient or the funder. So you can have a look and see what's out there as well. And also another way is sort of talking to other local organisations, so talking to other VCSE organisations to find out who, what funding is going on locally, who perhaps has received funding and for what, who's been successful in the past, who hasn't. So planning your application. So ensuring that the main contact is well briefed on the project is, it sounds obvious, it is, but sometimes it doesn't happen. So for instance, let's say you've got a volunteer who might be filling out an application on behalf of the group, and they put the main contact down as maybe the project manager or the lead. But obviously that person might not have all the answers. If, let's say, a member of the grants team calls and has some queries about the application. So obviously make sure that everybody's well briefed, talk to your committee to get their input on things like the budget, what activities are going to be delivered, how you're going to be doing the monitoring and evaluation, and also get their expertise. So it again might sound obvious, but if you're looking at the budget, have a chat with your treasurer, make sure that that everything makes sense and is sort of in line with what is being able, what's able to be achieved. Plan the project as a draft. So plan the application as a draft before completing the form. So take the time to read through the questions thoroughly and make sure that the information that you provide is accurate. Obviously, funders, they're able to check information on things like charity commission or company's house, things like that. So make sure that your information is up to date and correct on your applications. Also, don't assume that the funding organisation is going to know your organisation or your group or its track record, particularly because, for instance, we'll just use NCF as an example. We might, as a grants team, we might know groups fairly well if there's been a funding relationship over the years in terms of applications coming in. However, our grants panels are made up of our trustees and our volunteer grants advisors, and trustees regularly come and go. So in terms of over a 3 or 6 year cycle, and we have different trustees coming into different grants panels, so we get different perspectives. But that means that they're not necessarily going to know every organisation that applies, and obviously that's the same for all funders. Don't assume that your reputation goes before you. Be clear and specific about what you want to do. So try not to be too vague in applications. So you might talk about, oh, we want to reduce isolation, but that's your overarching goal, but we want to know how you plan to do that. So how, are you going to be doing for instance, a befriending cafe? How many times is that going to happen a week? Who's going to be, managing those sessions? How are you going to get volunteers in? We like to know the details. Also, allow yourself plenty of time to plan and prepare your application. it can obviously, particularly if you're wanting other people's feedback, whether that's from your local infrastructure or another member of your team or from someone else, to have a look back over your application. Make sure that you plan that time in so that you're not doing things in a mad rush before the deadline. As I said, being specific and clear, so you describe the project, not what you want to achieve. Again, thinking about those who, why, when, where and how questions. Think about, have you sort of covered those areas within your application? So thinking about, what do you want to achieve? Where is it going to happen? When is it going to start? Who is the project for? Who's going to be delivering it? So that you're creating a really clear picture in the grants panel, grant assessor's mind when they're looking over it. And make sure that when you're applying, that you are sending in all the correct supporting documents that you've been asked for. So whether that's copies of your policies, references, bank statements, copy of constitution, make sure that those are getting sent in at the correct time with the application to the right place, so that, again, you're not going to get turned down because of technicalities. Other things to think about is, do you have any existing partners or stakeholders that you should talk about within your application? So again, thinking about that evidence that you're working with local people, that you know the area. Where are your beneficiaries coming from? So how are you going to get people to come along to your service? Are they being referred in by professionals, or whether that be social workers or social prescribers are referring them in, or are you going to be as a project for existing service users and beneficiaries? Obviously, we've talked about evidencing the need, and another thing that funders often think about is the plan realistic? Is it deliverable? And is it proportionate? Is it value for money in terms of the number of estimated beneficiaries? So are you asking for £10,000 for a project that's only going to reach 10 people? Things like that. Thinking about that idea of the impact that the project is going to have. And obviously then talking about impact, thinking about, have you talked about what positive changes that you're hoping to see at the end of the project? Is it going to be tackling specific needs in your area? Also thinking about, are you able to measure those impacts? So measure that change that you're going to see. So thinking about how you do that, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. And also sustainability is often a question that comes up in applications. So thinking about, have you thought about what's going to happen once your grant has been spent? So have you got a plan for perhaps other sources of funding? Have you thought about partnerships in the future? Have you thought about a pipeline, upskilling volunteers, all of those things to ensure that the project has got longevity if it is funded and it's that kind of project? Obviously, sometimes it is a one-off project that happens specific time, specific place. But if it is something that's going to be going on long term, how are you going to support that? And then also with your budget, make sure it's clear and it's accurate. So a bit more about the budget. Sorry, I was going to take a drink. So don't guess at your figures, don't assume or inflate the budget. For thinking that obviously you'll get more if you inflate the budget. Try and keep it as realistic as possible. Provide as much financial information as possible. So you're often given in applications a space to do a budget breakdown of figures and where those different pots of money are going to go in terms of whether it's your overhead costs, your volunteer costs, transport, capital, staff costs. Allow for a different range of budget themes to ensure that it's as clear as possible how the project is going to be supported and how the grant will be used to pay for different areas. Also think about if you're going to be asking for capital projects, think about providing quotes. Often they want to see more than one quote. So for instance, if you are asking for a new roof for a building, they probably will want to see that you've approached a range of different construction and building companies so that you're getting the most competitive price out there. Also, think about whether you require match funding. So some funders will fund 50% of a project and expect there to be match funding involved, so factor that in as well. And then also thinking about whether you've included some things that often get left out is things like publicity costs or marketing or admin costs. So make sure that you include as many of those different areas as possible when you're thinking about putting together a budget. Make sure that you've got financial systems in place. So we've talked about making sure that you've got a bank account with banks, 2 bank signatories, and also think about whether you have a process where, so for instance, at NCF, to help reduce the likelihood of fraud, we have some people in the building, some members of staff who can set up backs payments, and there are some people who are there to approve. So for instance, I couldn't set up a backs payment to pay myself X amount of money with no oversight from anyone else. I can set something up, but it has to be approved. And of course, that's where checks and things come in. So making sure that you've got financial systems in place. And also something that comes up a lot is make sure that it all adds up correctly. Double check, triple check that all the figures add up correctly, because that's probably one of the most common mistakes that we see in grant applications, is just things, once we get the calculators out, they just don't add up right. So please just double check that before hitting that submit button on an application. Also, think about when you're going to start the project as well. So if, for instance, you are applying for some funding, you put the application in, but actually you're planning to start it a few weeks later, that's not realistically enough time for a funding decision to come back to you. And what that can mean is that obviously that you have started the project sometimes without getting that funding decision, and that turns into retrospective funding. And I don't know of any funders that do retrospective funding. They won't fund an activity that's already taken place. So if there is something that you need funding for, make sure that you're allowing enough time in advance to get the funding and to receive answers back about funding, rather than ploughing straight ahead, because often that means that you've just made yourself ineligible. You can apply to other funders at the same time. So let's say you do a bit of a scattergun approach and apply to multiple different funders for a project. You can do that, but if you receive funding from somewhere, then you have to let the other funders know that and withdraw those applications which are in progress, because you can't receive funding twice for the same project, because that's turning into grant fraud. Make sure that when you're filling out an application that the information you put in is really easy to understand. So try and avoid abbreviations or jargon, because that can often just hinder the process. And as I've mentioned before, proofreading, getting someone to look at your draft before you submit is really useful. Then if you are successful in getting the grant funding, make sure that you read the grant agreement and contract carefully, check the deadlines for reporting back to the funder, check things like whether you need to publicly acknowledge the grant that you've received. So do you need to make sure that you've got logos on there, that you are tagging them in social media? Do you need to send out a press release, etc., those sorts of things? And then if on the flip side, your application is turned down and rejected, you can ask for feedback and think about how you can improve for next time. Of course, you can get advice from the funder, but also if you think that you could perhaps get advice from maybe your local infrastructure organisation or another organisation to maybe look through with you and see perhaps where it went wrong. So I mentioned this a bit earlier on about measuring impact. So once you've received funding, often there will be an evaluation process or an end of grant report, evaluation and monitoring. So this is being able to let the funder know how the project went. Often it's providing a bit of narrative about how it went, perhaps some case studies about a particular person that took part and how it benefited them. And then sometimes it can also include outcomes and indicators. So we've talked about that again a bit earlier on, where I mentioned things like reducing social isolation or improving community cohesion. You might have had to pick some outcomes or goals that you're hoping your project's going to achieve. And then you have to show how you've measured that and how you've perhaps achieved those goals that you set out to achieve. So thinking about how can you measure that? So how can you measure whether you've reduced social isolation? So that could be through surveys and questionnaires, it could be through interviews. You could, for instance, if it's a capital project, you could take photographs. Or it could be an event that you're hosting. So you could, again, photographs, videos, feedback, questionnaires, comments. You could have, there's lots of different imaginative ways of doing it, but there's also sort of those tried and tested ways of measuring impact, thinking about keeping a track of the number of people that have come along to the sessions that you've provided, how many hours of community work or community activities have you provided. It's really important to think about this aspect at the application stage, because once you've said these are the things that we're going to measure in your application, then you do need to do that throughout the project, so that when you come to the end of grant report, the evaluation and monitoring report, you can give that evidence back. So it's not just a tick box exercise at the start in the application. If you've said that you're going to monitor and evaluate an aspect, you do need to do that throughout the whole project, so that you've got something to deliver at the end. Again, this is something that you can get advice on and support on. You can either chat to the funder if you're unsure and need a bit of advice, or again, have a chat to your local infrastructure organisation. I often do an annual workshop alongside Alison with Voluntary Impact Northamptonshire to look at social impact and monitoring and evaluation. So there are workshops out there and advice online about measuring impact if it's something that you're not used to doing. So just to sum up, it's thinking about, have you got the right people in place to get the project happening and off the ground? Have you got a clear idea about what you want to do? talking to people and making sure that you do the research, and then reading the information and guidance that's available, getting advice from other people around you, getting drafts looked at, and as I said, utilising the resources, particularly whether that's from the funder themselves or your local infrastructure organisation. When you're a lot of grant giving organisations, there's an element of risk when you're giving out funding, because often you're giving out thousands of pounds to somebody or to an organisation that you may have not met before. And so applications are a way of helping to gain information and understanding about that organisation, what they're trying to achieve. And so applications are a way of helping to inform, educate and reassure funders that you've got a plan in place, that you have the resources to deliver that work, and that you are giving them confidence, that instilling that confidence in them that you can achieve what you're setting out to achieve. So there's just some information about how to get in contact with us at Northamptonshire Community Foundation if you want to have a chat about any grants that we've got on offer. Happy to have a discussion if you are looking for funding at the moment in Northamptonshire. So that is me. I will stop sharing now. And if anybody has got any questions, please put your hand up or unmute yourself and ask away. I've given out all the advice ever possible, and I've answered all the questions that anybody could ever have about funding. Brilliant.
Alex, I was just going to say one thing, and this is not in my capacity working for Northamptonshire NACRE, but I'm actually working on a project where we've got a lot of funding we need to raise. And I think your tip about making sure that your voluntary organisation is in a good enough state, as it were, a prepared state, in order to embark on the project. So things like, you know, we're in the situation where we have an elderly treasurer who really should have retired, and we've got another person who's sort of acting treasurer. We should have sorted that out before starting, actually. It's made it quite difficult. So, or like, you know, note to self in future, just make sure that as an organisation, you're prepped and ready to be doing it.
Yeah, I think that that is something that sometimes, because often, you know, as particularly voluntary and community organisations, everybody wants to be able to do great work to help the community, and sometimes it's just taking a step back and going, okay, we need some time, even though the need is often quite imminent, as it were. Sometimes just giving us time, some space to plan and prepare can make the difference between spending a long time writing applications, putting that effort in, for them sadly then to not work out. Whereas if you just perhaps take that more time to plan and prepare, there's increases your likelihood of success in the future. But yeah, thank you for that example, Francis. It's and I think having a great team of trustees or a great committee on board that have the right skills in place can really help an organisation, particularly in terms of delivering projects and applying for funding.
I mean, your point as well about getting people to look over applications and involving everybody is so important as well, because I mean, I've often met with organisations who are looking to apply for something, and when you talk to them, it's really clear what it is they're trying to achieve, and it's a really you have a really interesting conversation. And then when it comes to a form, because there's so much stuff in people's head, it doesn't always necessarily make it onto the form. So that having somebody to look over it who doesn't know that much about the project is so important, because they can say, well, I don't quite understand how this bit fits together. And, you know, and I think it's not necessarily something people think of until it's gone and they think, oh, I should have put that bit in, because when it's all in your head, you don't necessarily remember. But yeah, I mean, it's really crucial, I think. Oh, Donna, did you have a question?
Hi, that was really, really helpful. I was just wondering, because I may want to watch this back, will the recording be shared? Because it was a lot of information there.
It will be. It will go out to the Northants Council website. So they're dealing with all the admin and the bookings and things for us. So it won't be just yet, because we'll finish today, and then they'll start putting all the stuff up, I think, next week. But there is still the presentations from last year, I think, up there. But yes, we'll be adding them all on. Fabulous. So you'll be able to access all the information there.
Thank you.
Okay, does anybody else? I'm not surprised there aren't many questions, because that was a really thorough run through. That was brilliant. Thank you. So if no one else has any questions, it just sort of remains for me to thank both our speakers today, Alex and Francis, and just to say again, yes, everything will be uploaded. And if you don't mind going onto the website, the Northants Council website, to complete our prize draw, you might win a John Lewis voucher. So thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next year.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.